Welcome to In These Times, a multi-platform podcast and YouTube broadcasting channel for mental health issues. We want to address mental pain and emotional suffering by bringing you information that can alleviate your distress. And you may make some important mental shifts that bring back your light, your love, your hope. Please use the Contact Us button on our website to let us know your deepest troubles and concerns with your mental health. Help us to help you. Now, we all know that today racism is a real issue. It's hostile, divisive, and has resulted in huge turbulence in society. We've seen large-scale movements such as Black Lives Matter in the US and the UK. But this has been met with an opposite rise in nationalist aggression and populist abuse towards different races. No society seems to have solved the problem of racial hate. So what are the causes of racism in our minds? Is it purely social, economic, or historic? Or could it be psychological? Can there ever be an end to it? And how effective are our ways to combat it? Well, here to help us think about some of these issues is the co-founder of In These Times, Previn Karian. Now then, Previn, perhaps we could just explain what racism is and why we have it.
Gosh, that's quite a starting question. I think racism has been misdiagnosed for centuries, if not thousands of years, as something to do with different cultures, something to do with different histories, something that can be put right by the law, and something that can be broken through by education. What we know is that all of these things have failed, and it appears they haven't even scratched the surface of the problem, what is racism? What we're trying to do here In These Times is to engage psychologically with social issues. And it is far better to think of racism as a mental disorder, okay? Because it is based on extreme hate. It's not a difference, it's extreme hate. It's extreme anger, and it results and erupts in violence. Surely that is, if not a criminal disorder, it does indicate a mental disorder. And the trouble with that is that there is no drug, there is no cure for racism, and so it doesn't appear in the DSM-5 or in psychiatrist diagnosis. But it is clearly a disordered and very weird state of mind that the human species seems to act out on each other. So we have to start thinking about racism psychologically and get away from all of the failed ways of looking at racism, which have actually got us nowhere. And that's factual.
Well, we'll come to, some of the hot potatoes are sport, of course. There are so many issues which are linked to racism. But the one thing that people try and do is blame our history or blame people who featured in our history, like in colonial history. So they love nothing better that in the case of, somebody like Clive of India and say, well, he was a terrible villain and he had slavery and he was an awful man, or Cecil Rhodes in South Africa, who actually, do I dare say it, actually did a few quite good things for the countries.
Yeah, I think that there are several problems psychologically that come out in what you're saying. So one of the problems is that there was a huge amount of really bizarre, unnecessary violence and brutal exploitation from white people towards other countries. And that is a historical fact which has got turned into an issue of racism. And what happens with racism is that it gets stuck in this colonial history. So the term for that is colonial, and anything to do with a colonial history is now vilified and attacked as racist or racism. Now, the problem with positioning racism in history is that all it results in is shaming white people. And guess what, folks? They're not going to listen. Okay, they're going to get defensive, they're going to feel angry, even if what you're saying is true and right. They are not going to hear the issue of race. So you cannot tackle race through history, because all you end up with is white shaming, and white shaming is going to produce the opposite reaction. And that's what we've seen in all of this nationalist and populist aggression and all that mobilization of hate and anger towards other minorities. What we've seen is that it doesn't work to go on about histories. You are actually generating, psychologically, you will guaranteed generate the opposite effect of nationalist fascism.
Yes, well, people feel a lot better if they go and pull down a statue, you know. It does wonders for their hate.
Well, it may do wonders for their hate, but the issue of racism is stuck somewhere really complex. And that is the fact that all races hate each other. Okay, so you have, even within, for example, the black communities, where different groups of black people can hate other black people.
Oh yeah, tribal.
Exactly that. You have racism within white-skinned people.
Yes.
Okay, you can have
Bosnian Serbs, yep.
Exactly that. We've seen it in Europe.
Yep.
We've seen it in this country with a hatred of Irish people that we had to kind of get over. Then it became the Pakistanis and the Indians who were being imported to solve the labour shortage in the 60s. And then it's amazingly became the Poles and the EU. So you can clearly see from this, it's not really about skin colour. Racism can't be located there. You're failing entirely to understand the problem if all you go on about are statues and what's happened in history. So hate away by all means if that's what you need to do, but it's not coming close to the problem of racism, which is psychological.
Well, I wonder what you do with this endless stream of black African Americans in the US who have been killed by police. Often they've got off on appeal. Nobody's kind of carried the can for this. I mean, you can think of so many examples of bullying and so on, where people feel better if they can actually see people be punished.
Yeah, so we can now move somewhere towards the psychology of racism. And certainly my way of looking at it is based on Sigmund Freud's amazing work called Totem and Taboo. And in that work, Freud is essentially saying, it's a crude summary, what he says is that people need a totem pole around which they organise social life. They need some kind of sense that they belong to a group. Now, in primitive times, every culture had its own totem pole, as it were, their own set of values, their own practices, their own way of doing things, getting married, working and organising society. What has happened is that with the increase of populations, those totem poles are now competing with each other, and they're not able to tolerate the differences that people have, whether it's skin colour, whether it's immigration, they can't bear the difference. So what happens is that what is your totem pole starts to become a stick with which you beat other people up who are different and have a different totem pole. And of course, they will beat you back. So when black people complain to white people that you are not respecting our totem pole, you're not respecting our values, you're not respecting our history, white people will beat them back with their totem pole and say, sorry, you don't respect our history, you don't respect us.
That's right. If you take George Floyd, who was killed by the police, had his breath removed from his body while somebody filmed it, so we know it. What you've got the result is Black Lives Matter, where people at football matches are taking the knee, and you've got people who are saying, well, what's the point of all this? He was a villain anyway, you know, he was a troublemaker. I mean, why are we making such a fuss about it? That's quite a common view on the street, you know.
Yes, indeed. And it is a common view on the street, and it is important to say that. And the discrediting of black men when they are filmed being murdered by a police person, it's an interesting response, isn't it? To come back and say, but he did have a criminal record, so that makes it all okay to put your knee on somebody for 9 minutes and kill them. Sorry, it doesn't. But we get to a really important point here. Black Lives Matter is a very US-specific movement responding to the totem pole issues going on in the US. Now, in the US, Racism is macro-aggression. It is in the system. It is in the institutions. It is in a whole history of slavery, and it's in the whole history of lynching and exploiting black people, as well as, by the way, the genocide of the native Indians. Now, when you think about that as racist hate, that has gone on and goes on, what's happened in the US is it's fed into the system. It feeds into the legal system. It feeds into economic systems. It feeds into housing policies where there is this process called redlining, where black people are not allowed to buy houses in white areas. That's going on today. So you can see from this that there's no point going on about, oh, well, there was a history of slavery. That's not solving the psychological problem. What's going on is that people in the US are fighting a totem pole battle between who wins the system, who wins the legal systems, the economic systems. In the UK, it is absolutely different. And the way racism goes on psychologically in the UK is more about microaggressions. So if you take the examples of sport, they're kind of happening in locker rooms, they're happening in corridors, they're happening at work, they're happening if you unfortunately write a book about the empire and you're going to get trolled off your head with racist abuse because you dared to shame white people. But what else did you expect?
Well, we'll come to sport in a minute. In fact, I'll just touch on one. I mean, this is extraordinary. I mean, I don't know what your view of punishing somebody who wrote this is. Ebony Rainford Brent. Now, she was the first black woman to play for an England cricket team. She's got an MBE. She's very accepted in the establishment of Britain. She's black. She's 37. So she gets a letter, opens it, and it says, "White cricket culture is white culture, you racist bitch. Who invited you to my country? Go, bitch, go. White culture is wiping your ass with white toilet paper. We found you naked in Africa, Ebony. Naked, illiterate, primitive. Yes, primitive, Ebony. Leave our country, bitch. Leave now. Go, go, today." And as she pointed out, she was born in South London, and but apparently was found naked in Africa as a primitive. She said, "I had some letters in my time, but that was right up there." Now, what are you going to do if you can even find the person that wrote that?
Of course, you need laws to stop racist hate. And there looks like that there is some kind of conflict in democracies between having the right to free speech, such as that person has allegedly a right to free speech, and targeted hate abuse, which is a very different level of speech. Now, we think we have free speech and that that person should have the right to speak their racist hate out at a person. But speech is not free. So, for example, if you decided that you wanted to support Palestinian people and human rights there, you would be classed as anti-Semitic. So you are not free to support Palestine or speak for Palestine. Now here we have racism again, okay? So racism is happening all the time, and every culture is racist. Every person is racist. You and I sitting across this table are racist.
So the person that wrote that to Ebony, you say it's got a psychological root. So what psychological illness has that person got?
That is the backlash. That is the white backlash towards all of this Black Lives Matter movement, which actually doesn't hugely apply in the UK. By all means, express solidarity with the movement, and that's fantastic. But the history of racism in this country has a different complexion, if I can use that word. And the way that it has come over and swept over the UK, almost as a fad, has created the white backlash. But guess what? It's created the white backlash in the US. So trying to say to these people, don't post your tweet, don't send hate mail, of course that should be stopped. But you can make laws against that, and you can say hate speech targeted at different ethnicities, white or black, should not be allowed. And that's, John Stuart Mill wrote a book on liberty, and he's a great libertarian. But one of the things he says is, the two fundamentals of liberty: you are not allowed to incite people to hatred, There is a limit to free speech. And of course, the other one is the destruction of property or people. Now, we fundamentally need that in democracies. Free speech does not mean that kind of abuse. So when you have targeted abuse, make a law, but you have not solved the problem. Do you honestly think that if you punish that person with 3 years in jail or £50,000 fine, do you think you will come close to changing their racist mind and their racist opinions?
Because they'll meet a load of other people in jail who think the same.
So it's a psychological problem, and you can't address it through the law. You have to contain it through the law, but racism is a psychological problem, and all races are hating each other. You know, we talked about multicultural integration. Nobody has talked about multicultural hate, because that is the fact of society. And how can you solve a problem if you don't understand it? How can you come up with right answers when you haven't even got the right place of thinking, goodness me, we all hate each other?
Hate's a bit, I mean, if you're somebody called Michael Vaughan, you'd think hate was a bit over the top, which I think I'd agree with, really. So the situation is in sport in the UK, you have Azeem Rafiq, a British Asian cricket player, who took exception to some, well, what would be described as joshing about him, and it goes on everywhere. But anyway, he took it so seriously, he took it to the Commons, the Department of Culture, Media and Sport. He didn't like comments like, "You lot sit over there by the toilets," which were allegedly made. Now, Michael Vaughan, I suggest, didn't do, if that remark was made, he denies it. He says he didn't say any of these things. And thankfully, he's actually been given some chance to work again, which I think is right, personally, and a lot of other people would. Because surely he's had chance to think it over as whether he's actually got, you know, if he did say anything and if he regrets it. But hate is a terribly strong word, and you can't apply it to someone who just has a go at somebody on a cricket pitch.
Of course, this raises a fantastic issue around what is banter and what is hate speech. So if you take, for example, banter and joking about a Christmas party during a time of COVID, where apparently there was a party at number 10 Downing Street during a time when other people were not allowed to see people, their close loved ones dying in hospital. People were in lockdown, they couldn't see their families, and yet here were some people not just having a party at number 10, but they were joking about it. Now, isn't that a little bit of joshing? No, it's not. It's not funny, because there were people dying. And that's when banter suddenly becomes highly offensive and abuse, and it's resulted, you know, in a huge amount of turmoil and the loss of jobs within number 10. Now let's transplant that to racism. What's so funny about being told, "You lot sit over there by the toilets"?
Allegedly.
Allegedly. Whoever said that, okay, it's not funny. Now, if somebody said that to white people, "You lot go over there and sit by the toilets," do you honestly think that white people would simply sit there and say, "Oh, that's really funny, you're just joshing"? You would feel offended. Yes. So here we come down to racist hate, that different groups all think that the other one is racist. And actually, they're all racist. Now, the other point about the Rafiq situation was that he didn't care whether Michael Vaughan worked or got a job, was blocked by the BBC or not. He was not interested in Vaughan's reputation. He only wanted one thing. "Mate, I'm sorry. I am sorry I affected your mental health. I didn't know that my years and years of abuse, along with all the rest of us, okay, which has been documented because they are now being sacked, was neglected by the Yorkshire Cricket Board, and so on." So all he wanted was an apology. Now, interestingly, of course, Rafiq Azeem was then found to have made a comment about Jews.
Indeed, I was just going to come to that. You can't, it's double standards.
No, it isn't, because what he did is exactly what Michael Vaughan did not do and what white people don't do. He went up and apologised, but then talked to the Jewish community. He visited a synagogue. He let himself be interviewed by a right-wing magazine, The Spectator, by an editor of the Jewish Chronicle. He was then not quite vilified for his apology, but it was highly problematic because apparently he was playing perfect cricket while he apologised. And that piece ended up with, well, I don't know if he's apologising. You make up your own mind, because it could be possible that as a Jewish person, you are racist against Pakistani Muslims. And that's where we have to ask ourselves, is it possible for Jews to hate other races? Is it possible for Pakistanis to hate white people for what they keep doing in these microaggressions? So we got to come out of this idea that it was just Michael Vaughan. It's just a white problem. It's not a white problem. Mixed marriages, for example, are incredibly contentious within communities, and couples who do that have to go through a huge amount of explaining to both sides of the family why you married somebody with a different colour skin, why you marry someone with a different culture. So we are all still in a state of multicultural racism. We are all racist. And if you don't understand that as a psychological problem, if you don't understand there's something mentally disordered about this, that is to do with group psychology and group hate, you'll get nowhere.
Well, I think that the people that shriek at Marcus Rashford for not scoring a goal, I mean, this is a man, Marcus Rashford, who put himself out to make sure there's some really poor kids at half term got fed so that they did have meals at school. Otherwise, they might not have been. I mean, he's done a hell of a lot for people. And yet, when he doesn't score a goal, some people on the terraces decide they're going to have a real go. Why?
Yeah, it wasn't a real go. It was racist abuse, as it has been for Raheem Sterling, Saka. And back in the day, John Barnes, who was a football player for Liverpool, had bananas thrown at him. This is not banter. This is not just joking. It's not understandable anger from the fans. Okay, it is targeting the colour of somebody else's skin, thinking that they are different to me. And actually they're not. They're actually on your side. They're playing for England. Now, this is the psychological point, isn't it? That it doesn't matter if you're playing for England. It doesn't matter if you're as white people. It doesn't matter if you're successful. What matters is the colour of your skin, which must mean you have a different totem pole to us. So we're dealing with group psychology. We're dealing with group hate. And if you don't get that, you won't get anywhere with racism.
All right, so being the psychotherapist, you will tell us, I hope you're going to tell us, that all this comes from how we're brought up.
It's a different level, because when you get into group psychology, it kind of gets away from what happened in the family, and it starts to move towards, and this is Freud's great work with Totem and Taboo, and also his second crucial work in this field, which is called Group Psychology and the Ego. And what Freud is saying is, look, I've done my stuff about the families and depression and hysteria and so on. We need to think something else about group hate and why groups want to hate each other, annihilate each other, abuse each other, and feel this really mentally disordered compulsion to do that.
Well, if you look at South Africa, where they tried very hard after years of apartheid to sort it out, they decided to have a tribunal, Truth and Reconciliation, where the guilty, in quotes, were made to account for themselves without punishment. The victims also had their say. And it was all supposed to be, isn't it all great afterwards? Well, actually, no, it's not. You can't have a sensible conversation on racism, people tell me, in South Africa. It's still just under the surface. And the fact that they've tried to cover it over with setting up groups of people in, whether you're a teacher or a cricket player, you will have to have a balance of colour, hasn't done the job. So the other thing they say is multi-generational. If you send them all to school together, they will, in time, come to accept each other, and there'll be no racism, white and black and all colours. Is that going to work?
There is a view in sociology studies that is the trajectory of societies, because the white population is, as all races, in fact, the black population and other populations, are becoming extinct. Because there's so much mixed marriages, there are so many mixed marriages, there is so much racial integration actually going on, that historically, if you project this over time, there won't be a situation where we have purely black people and purely white people. There'll be less and less and less. And what will be the majority will be mixed race people that perhaps could work to a humanity. But you see, Truth and Reconciliation in South Africa, it really illustrates the point. It was an initiative from, I believe, Desmond Tutu. And it came out of a very spiritual impulse from the Church of England, trying to get the concept of forgiveness as some way of healing the nation, healing the group, okay, healing the collective hate that had been going on. And it illustrates the point. What black people wanted to hear was, yes, we were vile, we were evil, we were murderous, and we abused you terribly, violently, and so on. okay? We are white and we did that to you and we are sorry. Something apparently that Michael Vaughan found incredibly hard to do and still keeps saying, I didn't say anything. What people want to hear is, please stop with the lies. Can you just say sorry for the facts? Now, Truth and Reconciliation went some way to doing that. But again, it illustrates the problem, Chrissy. It can't be solved with spirituality. It isn't being solved with education. It's a psychological disorder, and it needs to be understood as a mental illness, because if you don't understand racism on that level, we won't get anywhere.
I don't think the Chinese government is particularly keen on to go into long-term therapy to get over what they're doing to the Uyghurs, really.
It isn't a case of long-term therapy. It's a case of applying psychotherapy to social issues. And that's something which certainly people like Andrew Samuels has been very politically active about. And to a high degree, people like Susie Orbach, both of whom we've interviewed, have understood that you can't just keep psychotherapy for individuals. They saw this huge potential that actually society and social conflicts can be understood in psychotherapeutic terms. So if you get a situation where people start working with sociologists, with political scientists, but bringing in the psychological dimension, which none of them want to face. They keep banging on about history. They keep banging on about the law needs to change. They keep banging on about critical race theory and education. And all it generates is more and more hatred, more and more division, and more shaming on all sides. Now, we have to find a different way of analysing the problem because our answers have failed. And what's the gap is clearly psychology. And by that, I mean specifically psychotherapeutic process. And Freud has outlined it. Carl Jung has got tons of work on the collective archetypes.
But it only works if people accept they've got a problem. And I suspect that a great many people are going to watch this, who we're going to meet over the next year or whatever. If you actually ask them, do you feel a lot of hate to an opposite race or another race, they'd say, what are you talking about? They'd never have thought about it.
Yes, and that there is a process where we all want to be white. We all want to be successful. The black man wants to be white was one of the founding principles of Frantz Fanon, who's a colonial critic. And black people can be more white than white people. Black people can be more successfully white than white people. And that's highly aggravating, okay? Jewish people can be more successful than white Europeans. And this generates a lot of hate. Now, it isn't a case of saying, let's all rush everyone into therapy. What's needed is that social policy has to be defined and based on informed psychotherapeutic concepts.
How is that? How is that going to happen?
It has to start with psychotherapists finally getting out of their one-to-one, sitting in a chair setting and applying their immense skills, their fabulous trainings, and starting to think about social and political issues and actually having a voice. Because at the moment, all you're hearing is one side hates the other. All you're hearing is shaming of white people, which then creates a backlash of shaming of the very minorities who are trying to move on from that. So psychotherapists, I think the burden falls with psychotherapists. It doesn't lie with governments. It doesn't lie with society. We are doing nothing, and we have to find more articulation on racism as a psychological mental disorder rather than pretend that it's all in the political field and it's all about histories and it's all cultural. It isn't. It's a psychological disorder. And really by now we've got the literature. We should be getting together as psychotherapists around the world and tackling and trying to understand what answers can we give society. But at the moment, we haven't even asked the question, is racism psychological? And that's what I'm hoping we can do here. It's not historical, it's not legal, you won't solve it by culture wars. So the problem really is with psychotherapists. It's not with governments, it's not with law. The problem is that psychotherapists have failed society today, and they need to start thinking about racism as a mental disorder and as a psychological issue.
Well, you've certainly made a very strong case, and thank you very much for it, Previn.
Thank you, Chrissy.
Great. In These Times is entirely based on your participation and your involvement. Please use the Contact Us button on the website to let us know your thoughts. Please also make a donation so we can go on bringing you more broadcasts. Help us to help you.